At Briar Ridge Medical Center, where trust is as sacred as the Hippocratic Oath, Dr. Kendra Lewis has always believed that honesty and integrity define what it means to be a doctor. A rising star in dermatology, Kendra's dedication to her patients and unshakable work ethic earn her a coveted invitation to join the hospital's Senior Specialists Board, a position that could transform her career forever. But just as the door to success swings open, Kendra begins to notice troubling inconsistencies. Patients diagnosed with severe illnesses that don't match their test results, costly treatments ordered without explanation, and lives being quietly pushed to the brink. Her instincts tell her that something is deeply wrong, but her search for answers makes her a target. When she uncovers a scheme orchestrated by a powerful group of senior doctors falsifying diagnoses to profit from inflated insurance claims, Kendra finds herself thrust into a dangerous game where her career, her reputation, and even her life hangs in the balance. As threats escalate and her strongest ally, a key witness, mysteriously disappears, Kendra is forced to ask herself, how far will she go to expose the truth? And what will it cost her to see justice served? With each step closer to the heart of the conspiracy, Kendra's world unravels. Betrayed, hunted, and alone, she must confront not only those who seek to silence her, but also her own fears as the walls close in. Will courage be enough to overcome those who hold all the power? Dr. Kendra Lewis sat at her small dining table, the edges of a tattered medical journal curling under her fingertips. Outside her window, the streetlights hummed quietly in the sleepy neighborhood of East Briar, a modest area where most residents had little to do with the city's glittering hospitals and skyscrapers. Her one-bedroom apartment was tidy but worn, decorated sparsely with mementos from her past. A framed photo of her late mother rested on the shelf, her soft eyes a constant reminder of the values she instilled in Kendra: hard work, kindness, and integrity. The clock on the wall read 9:47 p.m., and the buzzing of her phone broke the silence. She hesitated, staring at the screen flashing an unfamiliar number before picking it up. "Hello," Kendra said, her voice soft but firm. "Dr. Lewis?" The voice belonged to her supervisor, Dr. Ellen Carter, Chief of Dermatology at Briar Ridge Medical Center. "Congratulations, Kendra. You have been nominated to join the Senior Specialists Board. The official letter will follow, but I wanted to be the first to tell you." Kendra froze, the weight of the words sinking in. The Senior Specialists Board was the most elite group of physicians at Briar Ridge. Membership was a career-defining honor, reserved only for the most talented and trusted doctors. "Are you serious, Dr. Carter?" Kendra asked, her voice betraying a mix of disbelief and excitement. "Absolutely. Your dedication has not gone unnoticed, Kendra. You deserve this." Kendra leaned back in her chair, her pulse quickening. "Thank you. I don't know what to say." "You'll meet the board next week. Until then, keep up the good work," Dr. Carter replied. Her tone was encouraging, but clipped, as if there was more she wanted to say, but did not. The call ended abruptly, leaving Kendra alone with the silence of her apartment. For the first time in months, a smile crept across her face. This opportunity could change everything. The next morning, Kendra woke early, pulling on her navy blue scrubs and white coat. The sunlight spilled through the thin curtains, illuminating the mismatched furniture of her apartment. Her shoes clicked softly against the creaky wood floors as she grabbed her keys and bag. She drove her old sedan, one that groaned every time it turned through the morning fog, into the heart of the city, where Briar Ridge stood as a towering monument to modern medicine. The hospital's marble lobby reflected the ambition of those who walked its halls, physicians in pressed coats moving with purpose. Kendra felt the familiar surge of pride as she stepped inside, but her excitement was tempered with anxiety. The dermatology wing was her sanctuary. She greeted the nursing staff warmly as she pulled patient files from her locker. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the smell of antiseptic filled the air. "Kendra!" a voice called from down the hall. Dr. Eric Reynolds, her closest friend and confidant, jogged toward her with his lopsided grin. A tall, wiry man with shaggy brown hair, Eric had a knack for turning every situation into a joke. "Morning, Eric," Kendra said, offering a tired smile. "I heard the news." He bumped her shoulder lightly. "The senior board? Not bad, Dr. Lewis. You're moving up in the world." "I guess hard work pays off," Kendra replied, though her voice lacked the confidence the words implied. Eric tilted his head. "Something bothering you?" She shook her head. "I'm just overwhelmed. It's a lot to take in." Eric's grin softened. "You'll do great. Just don't let those board members intimidate you. They act like they own the hospital." Kendra nodded, appreciating the encouragement. She thought about the meeting scheduled for next week, the weight of the invitation hanging heavily on her shoulders. This was her chance to prove herself to honor the sacrifices her mother had made for her education. But there was something else gnawing at her thoughts. Later that day, Kendra reviewed patient files in her small office. She sat hunched over her desk, her pen tapping rhythmically against the table. One file caught her attention: Angela Cross, a 34-year-old woman diagnosed with a severe form of melanoma. According to the results, she required immediate and expensive treatment. Kendra frowned as she flipped through Angela's records. The diagnosis did not match the test results she remembered from Angela's initial visit. The biopsy report was inconclusive, yet the final notes stated Stage 3 melanoma in bold letters. That does not add up, Kendra thought. She pulled out Angela's original report and compared it to the updated version. It was subtle, but someone had altered the results. Kendra's heartbeat quickened. A simple clerical error, perhaps, she reasoned. But her instincts told her otherwise. The sound of a knock startled her. Dr. Michael Grant, the chief of internal medicine, stood in her doorway. He was a tall man in his late 50s, his salt and pepper hair and tailored suit lending him an air of authority. "Dr. Lewis," he said, his deep voice smooth but detached. "I heard about your invitation to the board. Congratulations." "Thank you, Dr. Grant," Kendra replied, sitting up straighter. He stepped inside, his presence filling the small office. "I trust you'll maintain the same discretion and professionalism that brought you this far." Kendra blinked, unsure of his meaning. "Of course, sir." Dr. Grant's gaze lingered on the files scattered across her desk. His expression was unreadable, but there was something unnerving about the way he looked at her. "Good," he said finally. "I will see you at the meeting." After he left, Kendra let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. She glanced at Angela's file again, her unease growing. That evening, as the city dimmed into twilight, Kendra sat on the worn couch in her apartment, the patient files spread across the coffee table. She had found 3 more cases with altered diagnoses, each involving costly treatments and billing to insurance companies. Her mother's framed photo stared back at her from the shelf, as if silently urging her to act. "What would you do, Mom?" Kendra whispered. The memory of her mother's voice returned to her. "The right path is often the hardest, Kendra, but you'll sleep better at night knowing you chose it." Kendra's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Eric. "Hey," she answered softly. "You sound terrible," Eric replied. "What's wrong?" "Eric, I think something's happening at Briar Ridge," Kendra admitted. "I found altered test results in a few patients' files. I think someone's manipulating diagnoses." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Kendra, are you sure? That's a serious accusation." "I wouldn't say it if I weren't sure." Eric sighed. "Look, you're new to all of this. The board's politics can get messy. Maybe it's a mistake." "I don't think it is," Kendra replied firmly. "What if patients are being treated for conditions they don't even have? Someone could get hurt, Eric." "Kendra," Eric hesitated. "You don't want to make enemies in that group. Trust me." His words stung more than she expected. "You think I should just ignore it?" "I think you should be careful," Eric said quietly. "That's all." After they hung up, Kendra stared at the files, the weight of her discovery pressing against her chest. She had always believed that doctors upheld a sacred duty to their patients, to heal, to protect, and to tell the truth. But now, as she sat alone in her apartment with the evidence of a brewing scandal in her hands, she realized she was standing at a dangerous crossroads, and somewhere deep down, a whisper of fear began to grow. The next morning, Kendra arrived at the hospital to find a small white envelope tucked under her office door. There was no name on it. She tore it open and pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. In thick, bold letters it read, "Stop asking questions. You won't like the answers." Her blood ran cold. Kendra sat down heavily in her chair, her fingers trembling. It was no longer a matter of suspicion. Someone knew what she had discovered, and they wanted her to stay silent. For a moment, she thought about ignoring it all. She could close the files, smile at her board meeting, and pretend none of this was happening. She could avoid conflict, protect her career, and ensure her safety. But the faces of her patients flashed through her mind: Angela Cross, the others whose health was being gambled with. Her mother's voice echoed once more. "Do the right thing, even if it scares you." Kendra took a deep breath, steeling herself. She would not walk away. The truth had to come out. Kendra stared at the note for a long moment, the black letters blurring slightly as her hands shook. The thin paper crinkled under the pressure of her grip before she forced herself to set it down on the desk. Her office, usually a safe and quiet space, suddenly felt smaller, claustrophobic even. She could hear the muffled sounds of activity outside her door: rolling carts, nurses discussing medication rounds, and the hum of hospital life. It was all so normal, yet her world felt far from it. "Stop asking questions." The words echoed in her mind, mixing with the questions she could not silence. Who knew what she had found? Who left this note? Was it a warning or a threat? Kendra's phone vibrated, making her jump. The screen lit up with Eric's name. She hesitated before answering. "Hey," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You sound awful," Eric replied immediately, his tone shifting from casual to concerned. "What happened?" "Nothing," Kendra lied. Her eyes darted toward the note on her desk. "I didn't sleep well." "You never could lie to me," Eric said softly. "What's going on, Kendra?" Kendra swallowed hard. A part of her wanted to tell him about the note, but another voice in her mind warned her to keep quiet. Eric had already advised her not to dig deeper. What would he say if he knew someone was watching her? Would he dismiss it as paranoia? "It's nothing," she said again, weaker this time. "Just stress." "Well, get it together," Eric replied, though his voice was kind. "You've got your board meeting next week, and you can't afford to let anything distract you. It's a huge opportunity." Kendra forced a smile she did not feel. "Yeah, I know. Thanks, Eric." He hung up with a promise to meet for lunch later, leaving Kendra alone with her thoughts. She shoved the note into the bottom of her desk drawer and locked it. She could not let anyone see it, not yet. The day passed slowly, each patient interaction feeling slightly off. Kendra checked and double-checked her charts, as if afraid someone would accuse her of another mistake. She had been more cautious since receiving her board invitation, wanting to prove she belonged in that elite circle. Yet now, a cloud hung over her every decision. She moved through her morning appointments mechanically, her professionalism masking her anxiety. But when she entered exam room 5 for her final patient before lunch, her composure cracked slightly. "Angela?" Kendra blinked in surprise. The young woman from yesterday sat on the exam table, fidgeting nervously with her sleeves. "Angela Cross." "Kendra, Dr. Lewis." Angela corrected herself quickly, offering a small, uncertain smile. I thought I'd come back." Kendra set her tablet down and leaned against the counter, searching Angela's face for answers. "What's going on? I wasn't expecting you. Angela shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting toward the closed door. I've been thinking about my diagnosis. What about it? Kendra asked carefully. Angela hesitated before speaking. You seemed confused during my last appointment. I thought maybe I should get a second opinion. But Dr. Grant said the diagnosis was certain and that the treatment was necessary. Kendra's heart sank. Dr. Grant. Angela, can I ask you something? Kendra said softly. Have you experienced any symptoms recently? Anything unusual aside from what we talked about before? Angela shook her head. No, I feel fine. That's what's bothering me. The treatments sound extreme and expensive. Kendra's pulse quickened. This was it. The confirmation she needed that something was very wrong. But before she could press further, Angela's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and paled. I have to go, Angela stammered, slipping off the exam table. I just wanted to ask. Angela, wait, Kendra said, moving toward her. This is important. If you're unsure, I can help you. No, Angela cut her off sharply, her eyes wide with fear. I can't. I'm sorry, Dr. Lewis. Before Kendra could say another word, Angela bolted from the room. The door closed behind her with a hollow thud, leaving Kendra standing there, stunned. At lunch, Kendra sat across from Eric in the hospital cafeteria, stirring her soup absently. Eric watched her with concern. Okay, seriously, what's going on with you? He asked. You've been a ghost all morning. Kendra hesitated. She could feel the words rising in her throat, but a sense of caution held her back. I had a patient earlier, she said finally. She's scared about her diagnosis. Something feels off. Eric frowned. You can't let yourself get too involved, Kendra. You know how it is some patients struggle to accept the truth. They're afraid of the worst. But what if the worst isn't true? Kendra countered. Eric's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Kendra opened her mouth to say more, but before she could, her phone buzzed. A text messages. She glanced at the screen, and her heart skipped a beat. Leave it alone, Kendra. Her eyes darted around the cafeteria, scanning for anyone who might be watching her. The crowd of doctors, nurses, and patients seemed completely normal, laughing, eating, talking. But someone knew. Eric noticed her reaction. Hey, are you okay? Yeah, Kendra said quickly, shoving her phone into her pocket. I just remembered something I need to do. I'll catch up with you later. Eric watched her leave with a look of confusion, but Kendra could not stay. She felt like she was suffocating. Back in her office, Kendra closed the door behind her and leaned against it, trying to calm her racing thoughts. 2 warnings in as many days, someone was clearly trying to scare her. And it was working. But why? Why would someone go to such lengths to cover up altered diagnoses? Who was benefiting from it? Her gaze fell on the patient files still spread across her desk. She picked up Angela's chart again, her eyes narrowing at the discrepancy in the biopsy reports. If someone had tampered with Angela's results, there were likely others. Kendra sat down, her resolve hardening. She pulled out a fresh notepad and began making a list, patient names, test results, and anything else that seemed out of place. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. The truth will set you free, Kendra. But first, you have to find it. For hours, Kendra pored over files, searching for patterns. She found 2 more cases similar to Angela's patients diagnosed with serious conditions that did not align with their initial test results. Each case had been handled by a senior doctor, including Dr. Grant. Her stomach churned as she pieced it together. It was not just a mistake, it was deliberate. And the deeper she dug, the more dangerous it felt. When Kendra finally glanced at the clock, it was nearly 9 p.m. The hospital was quiet now, most of the staff gone for the night. She rubbed her temples, her head pounding from the hours of strain. She began packing up her things when a knock on the door startled her. She froze. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice unsteady. No one answered. The hallway beyond her office door was silent. Kendra's chest tightened as she stepped closer, her footsteps echoing in the quiet. She gripped the doorknob and opened it slowly. The hallway was empty. Kendra let out a shaky breath, but as she turned back into her office, she noticed something. Lying on the floor just inside her door was another piece of paper. She picked it up with trembling fingers. "Last warning. Stop now, or you will regret it." Kendra's heart pounded in her chest. Someone was watching her, and they wanted her to stop. But Kendra had come too far to turn back now. She closed her office door, locked it, and sat down at her desk. If someone thought they could scare her into silence, they were wrong. Whatever was happening at Briar Ridge, she would uncover the truth no matter the cost. The following morning, Kendra walked through the hospital's glass entrance with her head down, her bag clutched tightly against her side. Sleep had been a distant thought last night, replaced instead by her mind spinning like a broken record. The warnings were growing bolder, the threats more unnerving, but they had not broken her yet. The familiar hum of Briar Ridge Medical Center greeted her. Doctors shuffled through the halls with purpose, nurses rattled medication carts, and patients' voices hummed softly in the background. The hospital felt alive, a heartbeat of its own. But to Kendra, it felt different today. Suspicious, as if the walls themselves were watching. "Stop now, or you will regret it." The note's words still echoed in her ears as she turned the corner to her office. To her surprise, the door was already ajar. She froze mid-step, her breath catching. Did I leave it open? Her pulse quickened as she pushed the door open slowly. The sight inside made her stop short. Her desk had been disturbed. Files that had been neatly stacked the night before now sat in disarray. The notepad she had been scribbling on, the one with patient names and discrepancies, was gone. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse. She hurried to the desk, searching through the drawers, flipping through the remaining files. It was pointless. Someone had been here. Someone had taken her notes. Kendra dropped into her chair, her hands gripping the armrests as she tried to steady her racing heart. The knot in her stomach tightened further. "They know I'm looking." Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She nearly jumped out of her seat as she pulled it out. The screen read, "Eric Reynolds." "Eric," she answered quickly, her voice shaky. "Good morning to you, too," Eric said, his light tone contrasting with her mood. "You sound like you've seen a ghost." "Someone was in my office," Kendra blurted out. "They took my notes, Eric. All of it, everything I was working on." There was a pause on the line. "Wait, what? Are you serious?" "Yes," Kendra said sharply, pacing the small space. "I didn't imagine this. Someone's trying to stop me from digging into the files." Eric sighed. "Kendra, I told you to leave it alone. Whoever's behind this isn't playing around." "I can't just leave it alone," Kendra snapped. "These are patients' lives we're talking about. If I walk away now, who's going to protect them? Who's going to stop this?" Another silence lingered, heavier this time. "Kendra, you don't know what you're up against." "Then help me," she said softly, almost pleading. "Please, Eric, I can't do this alone." Eric let out a long exhale. "Fine. Meet me in the old conference room on the 3rd floor. Nobody uses it anymore, so we'll have some privacy. Give me half an hour." Kendra ended the call, her hands still trembling slightly, as she shoved her phone back into her coat pocket. The 3rd floor of Briar Ridge was quieter than the rest of the hospital. The wing had once been home to a series of administrative offices, but much of it had been abandoned years ago when the hospital expanded. Kendra found the old conference room tucked at the end of a dark hallway. Its glass door was smudged with dust, and the blinds had been drawn shut. She pushed the door open cautiously. Eric was already there, standing by the far window, staring out at the city below. "You made it," Eric said without turning around. "I didn't have a choice," Kendra replied, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. They're escalating, Eric. First the warnings, now breaking into my office. It's getting worse. Eric turned to face her, his usual grin replaced by a look of concern. You're sure about this? That these test results have been tampered with? Kendra pulled a file from her bag and set it on the dusty conference table. Look at Angela Cross's records. The biopsy doesn't support the diagnosis, and she's not the only one. Eric hesitated before stepping forward. He flipped through the file, his brow furrowing as he read the notes. After a long moment, he looked up at her. You're right, he admitted quietly. This isn't just a mistake. It's deliberate. Kendra let out a shaky breath, relieved to have someone else see what she saw. Someone is falsifying diagnoses to bill insurance companies for expensive treatments that patients don't need. Eric set the file down and rubbed a hand over his face. And you think Dr. Grant is involved? He's in every case I've found, Kendra replied. If he's not responsible, he knows who is. Eric sat down heavily in one of the old conference chairs, his shoulders slumped. This is bad, Kendra. You're going up against some powerful people here. Dr. Grant practically runs this hospital. If he finds out what you're doing, he already knows, Kendra interrupted. That's why they're trying to intimidate me. Eric shook his head. You need to be careful. They'll ruin you if you push too hard. You know that, right? Kendra looked at him, her eyes fierce. I can't let it go, Eric. If we do nothing, patients will keep getting hurt. That's not why I became a doctor. For a long moment, Eric stared at her, searching her face. Finally, he sighed. Okay, you're right, but you can't do this alone. I'll help you, Kendra, whatever you need. Kendra blinked in surprise, warmth spreading through her chest. Thank you, Eric. Don't thank me yet, Eric replied, managing a faint smile. We're about to make some enemies. Over the next few days, Eric and Kendra worked in secret, meeting in the empty conference room late at night or early in the morning when no one would notice. Eric provided access to files from his department, cross-referencing patient records with Kendra's findings. The more they dug, the worse it became. There were dozens of cases patients diagnosed with conditions like advanced cancers or chronic illnesses they did not have, all prescribed unnecessary treatments and procedures. The financial records told the rest of the story. Inflated insurance claims, massive payouts, and quiet transfers to hidden accounts. This is bigger than I thought, Eric muttered one evening as they pored over a spreadsheet of financial transactions. It's not just Dr. Grant. There are others involved, other doctors, maybe even administrators. Kendra leaned back in her chair, exhausted. How could they do this? These are real people's lives. Greed, Eric replied simply. It always comes down to money. Kendra rubbed her temples, her heart heavy with frustration. We need more than just files. We need a patient who's willing to testify. Eric frowned. What about Angela Cross? She's scared, Kendra said quietly. And I don't blame her. If they've been threatening me, who knows what they've done to her? Eric nodded. Then we'll find someone else. There has to be a patient out there who's willing to speak up. Kendra closed her eyes, fighting back the wave of exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. She had always believed that being a doctor meant helping people, protecting them. But now, it felt like a war one she was not sure she could win. Eric's voice broke through her thoughts. Hey, Kendra. She looked up at him. You're doing the right thing, he said softly. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but you are. Kendra managed a small smile, the weight on her shoulders easing just slightly. I hope so, Eric, he grinned faintly. I'll keep digging. You get some sleep. You look like hell. Kendra laughed quietly, the sound surprising even herself. It was a small moment, but it reminded her that she was not completely alone. As she gathered her things and left the empty conference room, Kendra's resolve hardened. Whoever was behind this, whatever they were hiding, she would find it. And she would not stop until the truth came out, even if it cost her everything. The rain fell in a steady rhythm the next morning, streaking the hospital's glass facade in watery patterns. Kendra sat at her desk, her fingers curled around a half-empty mug of coffee that had long gone cold. She had barely slept. The discoveries from the past few days churned in her mind, pieces of a puzzle she could not yet complete. Eric had promised to keep digging into financial records, but Kendra knew their progress would only bring more scrutiny. Every time she stepped into Briar Ridge now, she felt eyes on her watching, waiting. She had half expected another note when she opened her office door earlier, but it had been empty, just her files and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. Her phone buzzed suddenly, jolting her. She grabbed it from her coat pocket. Anonymous text, "Stop now. You've been warned." Kendra's breath caught. Her stomach sank as she glanced toward the door, its narrow window showing only the empty hallway beyond. Who was doing this? How far would they go? Before she could process the message further, there was a sharp knock on her door. Kendra? It was Dr. Ellen Carter, her supervisor, standing just outside. She looked unusually serious, her graying hair pinned neatly back, and a frown etched deep into her usually calm features. "Come in," Kendra said, masking her unease. Dr. Carter stepped inside and closed the door softly behind her. She hesitated before speaking, her eyes studying Kendra closely. "We need to talk. Privately." Kendra set her coffee down, a chill creeping into her chest. "What's this about?" Ellen sat in the chair opposite Kendra's desk and folded her hands in her lap. "There's been a complaint filed against you. A serious one." Kendra blinked, the words not registering at first. "A complaint? About what?" Dr. Carter's expression softened, but there was a hint of something else there: concern, perhaps even pity. "Two patients' charts have been flagged for errors, critical errors that could have endangered their care. Both files were under your name." "What?" Kendra sat up straight, her voice sharp with disbelief. "That's not possible. I've been careful with every chart. I always double-check my work." "I know that," Dr. Carter said evenly. "But the errors are there. Medications prescribed incorrectly, treatment orders that don't align with diagnoses. The administration is already reviewing your cases." Kendra's mouth went dry. "Dr. Carter, this has to be a mistake. Someone must have altered those files." Ellen's brows drew together. "Are you saying someone is targeting you?" "Yes," Kendra said quickly. I've been looking into something irregularities with certain patient diagnoses. And now this? Someone is trying to discredit me." Dr. Carter sighed, leaning back in the chair. "Kendra, you need to be very careful about what you're suggesting. You're accusing someone of tampering with medical records. Do you have any proof?" Kendra hesitated. The truth was, she had pieces of proof: Eric's findings, the patient files she had quietly reviewed, but not enough to name names. Certainly not enough to stand up against someone like Dr. Grant. "No, not yet," she admitted quietly. "Then tread carefully," Dr. Carter replied, her voice firm but not unkind. "I like you, Kendra. You're talented and hardworking. But this complaint could jeopardize everything: your career, your license. Until we get to the bottom of this, you're on administrative leave, effective immediately." Kendra stared at her, stunned. "Administrative leave?" "It's temporary," Dr. Carter assured her, "but you need to step back while this is being investigated." Kendra opened her mouth to protest but stopped herself. What could she say? She felt the walls closing in around her, her carefully built world starting to fracture. "Fine," she whispered. Dr. Carter stood, her expression conflicted. "Take care of yourself, Kendra, and think about what you're getting into." When the door closed behind her, Kendra slumped in her chair, her hands trembling in her lap. "They're framing me." It was the only explanation. Whoever was behind the insurance fraud was now turning their focus on her, setting her up to take the fall. She glanced at her desk, where Angela's empty file sat like a ghost. She had started this search for the truth to protect her patients, but now it was her own reputation, her livelihood on the line. And she was completely alone. Kendra spent the afternoon in her apartment, her mind racing as the rain tapped steadily against the windows. The small living room felt suffocating now. A stack of medical journals sat untouched on the coffee table, and her phone buzzed intermittently with messages she ignored. Eric had called twice already, but she could not bring herself to answer. What could he say? "I told you so?" Her thoughts drifted to her mother again. When Kendra was in medical school, her mother used to say, "Hard times don't define you, Kendra. It's how you fight through them that shows who you are." But this felt like a fight she could not win. A knock at the door startled her. She froze. Another knock came, this one more insistent. "Kendra?" She recognized Eric's voice. "Hold on," she called, forcing herself to her feet. She opened the door to find Eric standing there, a raincoat dripping onto the welcome mat. His expression was grim, but his presence was a relief she did not know she needed. "Can I come in?" he asked. She stepped aside, letting him enter. Eric peeled off his coat, shaking the water from his hair. "I've been calling you all day. You scared me for a second." "I'm fine," Kendra muttered, though her voice lacked conviction. Eric looked at her closely, his brows furrowed. "What happened?" "They put me on leave," Kendra admitted, her voice low. "2 patient charts were altered under my name." Eric's face darkened. "That's impossible." "I know." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Eric pulled a folder from his bag and handed it to her. "I've been digging like you asked," he said. "And you're not crazy. Someone is covering their tracks, and they're doing it fast. Look at these financial records. Huge payouts, all tied to patients with altered diagnoses. There's a name popping up in a lot of the paperwork, Dr. Grant's." Kendra's heart sank as she flipped through the pages. The numbers were damning thousands of dollars funneling through accounts, all masked under the guise of advanced treatments. "This is it," Kendra whispered. "Proof that something's happening." "It's not enough," Eric said. "The administration won't listen to us without more evidence. They'll say you're just trying to save yourself from the complaint." "Then we'll get more evidence," Kendra replied, her voice steady now. "We'll talk to patients, find someone who'll back us up." Eric hesitated. "And if nobody talks?" "Then we keep going until someone does." Eric gave her a faint smile. "You're stubborn, you know that?" Kendra managed the smallest of grins. "I learned from the best." That evening, as the rain slowed to a drizzle, Kendra sat alone on her couch with Eric's folder spread across the coffee table. The evidence was growing, but so was the risk. Every step closer to the truth brought another threat, another wall thrown up in her path. She glanced at her phone, wondering if Angela Cross would ever return. Angela had been her first clue, someone who knew something was not right, but was too scared to speak up. Kendra understood that fear now, but she also knew she could not walk away. As she leaned back against the couch, exhausted but resolute, a text lit up her phone. "Unknown number. This is bigger than you. Walk away." Kendra stared at the screen, her jaw tightening. The message was a warning, but it only hardened her resolve. She picked up Eric's folder again, flipping to the names of the patients whose lives had been turned into transactions. "They deserve better than this," she thought. Kendra set the folder aside and glanced at the framed photo of her mother on the shelf. Her soft, kind eyes, a reminder of why Kendra had chosen this path. "You raised me to fight," Kendra thought, her chest swelling with quiet determination. "And I'm not stopping now." The next morning, Kendra woke to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. She grabbed it, squinting at the screen in the pale light filtering through her curtains. It was Eric. "Kendra, you need to get down here now," Eric said the moment she answered. His voice was low, urgent, a tone she had never heard from him before. Down where? Kendra asked, still groggy. Briar Ridge. Something's happening with Angela Cross. Kendra sat up abruptly. Angela? What do you mean? She's back at the hospital, Eric said quickly. Admitted through the ER this morning. But Kendra, something's wrong. You need to see this for yourself. I'm on my way, Kendra replied, already swinging her legs over the side of the bed. She dressed quickly, adrenaline pushing her fatigue aside. Angela Cross had been her first clue, her first real confirmation that something was wrong. If Angela was back at Briar Ridge, this was Kendra's chance to learn more. But Eric's tone worried her. The hospital parking lot was still wet from the night's rain, and the gray clouds hanging low over the city mirrored Kendra's mood. She hurried through the hospital's front doors, her sneakers squeaking against the tile floor. Eric was waiting near the nurse's station in the ER, his arms crossed, his expression tense. When he spotted her, he motioned her over. She's in room 12, Eric said quietly as she approached. She collapsed at home. Paramedics brought her in this morning. Kendra's stomach dropped. What happened to her? Eric glanced around before leaning closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Someone adjusted her treatment plan. She was put on a chemo regimen she didn't need. It's taking a toll on her body, Kendra. Kendra's breath caught. What? I checked the files, Eric continued. It's all there. The chemo protocol was ordered under your name. Kendra felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. What do you mean under my name? I don't know how, but someone entered your credentials into the system. They made it look like you signed off on Angela's treatment plan. Kendra shook her head in disbelief, her voice trembling. This is insane, Eric. They're not just trying to ruin me, they're hurting her. I know, Eric replied, his expression dark. And Angela isn't the only one. I think they're making examples out of patients who ask too many questions. Kendra swallowed hard, the weight of it all pressing down on her. Angela had trusted her. She had come to Kendra for answers, and now she was paying the price. Is she awake? Kendra asked. Eric hesitated. Barely. She's weak, but she's asking for you. Kendra entered room 12 quietly, her heart heavy with guilt. Angela lay in the hospital bed, her face pale and gaunt, her dark hair pulled back loosely. She looked small against the stark white sheets, her hands resting limply at her sides. Angela turned her head as Kendra approached, her tired eyes flickering with recognition. Dr. Lewis, Angela said softly, her voice barely audible. Hey, Angela, Kendra replied, pulling the chair closer to the bed. How are you feeling? Angela gave a faint, bitter smile. Like I've been hit by a bus. Kendra's chest tightened. I'm so sorry, Angela. I don't know how this happened, but I promise you I didn't approve that treatment plan. I believe you, Angela murmured. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering her strength. They're watching me, aren't they? The doctors? Kendra hesitated, unsure of how much to say. Who's watching you, Angela? Do you know who's behind all this? Angela opened her eyes again, tears glistening in the corners. I don't know names. I just know someone called me. A man. He told me to keep quiet about my diagnosis or things would get worse. Kendra's hands curled into fists. They threatened you? Angela nodded weakly. I was scared. I thought maybe they were right, that I shouldn't question anything. But then I started feeling sick, and I knew something wasn't right. Kendra's throat tightened. She reached out and gently squeezed Angela's hand. Listen to me. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to make sure they can't hurt you or anyone else ever again. Angela's lips trembled. Be careful, Dr. Lewis. They're dangerous. You don't know what they're capable of. The words sent a chill down Kendra's spine. She glanced at the monitors beside Angela's bed, the slow rhythm of the beeps sounding too fragile, too uncertain. I'll be careful, Kendra promised softly, but I won't stop. Outside Angela's room, Kendra found Eric leaning against the wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He looked up when he saw her, his expression grim. She told me someone threatened her, Kendra said quietly. They're the same people behind the altered records, I know it. Eric nodded. We need to bring this to someone higher up, Kendra. The administration, the medical board, someone. And say what? Kendra snapped, the frustration boiling over. That some unknown doctors are falsifying diagnoses and threatening patients? They'll bury it before it sees the light of day. Eric looked pained. So, what do we do? Kendra took a deep breath, her mind racing. We keep digging. We find more patients, more evidence, something they can't ignore, and we keep Angela safe. Eric nodded, though his expression remained uneasy. Kendra, you realize how dangerous this is, right? These people, they're not just playing with money. They're playing with lives. They could come after you next. They already have, Kendra said flatly. And I'm still here. Eric studied her for a moment, as if searching for the words to convince her to stop. But in the end, he only nodded. Then I'm with you. Kendra felt a flicker of gratitude, even in the midst of the chaos. Eric was the only person she could trust, the only one standing by her side when everyone else seemed ready to look the other way. That night, as Kendra sat alone in her apartment, her phone buzzed again. She hesitated before picking it up, her fingers trembling slightly. Another text from an unknown number. You were warned. Walk away before it's too late. Kendra stared at the words, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced around her small living room, the shadows stretching long against the walls. Suddenly, a loud thud came from outside. Kendra jumped to her feet, her pulse racing. She moved cautiously to the window and pulled back the curtain. In the dim glow of the streetlights, she saw her car parked in its usual spot. But something was wrong. The windows were shattered, glass glittering on the pavement like shards of ice. Her tires had been slashed, the rubber sagging uselessly against the ground. Kendra backed away from the window, her breath quick and shallow. They're not just trying to scare me, she realized. They want to stop me. She sank onto the edge of the couch, her head in her hands. For the first time since this ordeal began, fear crept under her skin and settled deep in her bones. But as the fear pressed in, a stronger feeling began to rise: anger, determination. Kendra looked back at her mother's photo on the shelf. Her mother's gentle eyes seemed to hold her gaze, as if reminding her of the values she had been raised with, the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it was hard. They can't scare me off, Kendra whispered to herself. They won't. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it was Eric. We've got a lead, he said the moment she answered. One of the nurses saw something in the system, more falsified test results. It's worse than we thought. Kendra's grip tightened on the phone. I'll be there first thing in the morning. As she ended the call, Kendra looked back at her shattered car outside and then to the shadowy corners of her apartment. They picked the wrong person to threaten, she said quietly, the fire in her voice stronger than before. She would not stop. Not now. Kendra arrived at Briar Ridge before dawn. The hospital parking lot was still cloaked in darkness, the streetlights casting faint halos onto the wet pavement. Her car, or what was left of it, was still parked outside her apartment, unusable. Eric had picked her up on his way in. Neither of them spoke much during the ride. The air between them was heavy, filled with unspoken fears and the weight of everything they had uncovered. They entered through the staff entrance, the hospital halls eerily silent at this hour. Nurses moved quietly, their footsteps soft against the tile floors, while the faint sound of monitors echoed in the distance. Eric led the way toward an unused records office on the second floor. It was out of the way, one of the few spots in Briar Ridge where they could work without raising suspicion. Are you sure this is safe? Kendra asked, her voice low as they entered the dim room. Eric turned to face her, his expression calm but serious. As safe as it's going to get. I checked no cameras in this office. No one comes here. The room was small, its walls lined with old metal filing cabinets and shelves stacked with forgotten paperwork. A single table and 2 chairs sat in the center, covered in a thin layer of dust. Eric dropped his bag onto the table and pulled out a laptop. "Okay," he said, powering it on. "Here's what I know so far." Kendra leaned over as Eric opened a series of files. Numbers, names, and dates filled the screen-organized chaos that made Kendra's head spin. "Angela Cross's treatment was just the beginning," Eric said, his voice tight. "There are dozens of other patients flagged for expensive procedures. All their records were altered, just like hers. Someone's been approving chemo treatments, surgeries, even false diagnoses, always with inflated insurance payouts." Kendra frowned, scanning the names. "And all of this was signed off under different doctors' names?" "Not just doctors," Eric replied. "Some of the names listed in the system are nurses and admin staff too. But it's all forged. None of them know their credentials are being used." Kendra shook her head in disbelief. "They're not just committing fraud, they're hurting innocent people, and they're trying to pin it all on me." Eric sat back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. "Kendra, this isn't just a handful of greedy doctors. This is a system. Someone powerful is orchestrating this, maybe even more than one person." Kendra's chest tightened. The truth was bigger than she had imagined. She had started this journey thinking she was chasing a single thread, but now it felt like an entire web, one that stretched across Briar Ridge and beyond. "What about Angela?" she asked suddenly. "Is she safe? We need her to testify. Her case could blow this open." Eric hesitated, his face clouding over. "I checked in on her this morning before picking you up. She's still weak, but—" "Kendra, something doesn't feel right." Kendra's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "She's under constant watch," Eric replied. "A nurse told me they moved her to a private recovery room overnight, but there's no record of the transfer. No orders. Nothing." Kendra straightened. "What? Where is she now?" "I don't know," Eric said quietly. "That's the problem." Kendra and Eric hurried to the 3rd floor, where Angela had been recovering the day before. When they reached her room number 12, it was empty. The bed had been stripped, the machines turned off, and the curtains drawn neatly against the window. It looked as though no one had ever been there. Kendra's stomach sank as she turned to Eric. "Where is she?" Eric checked the nurse's station nearby, flipping through the patient logbook. His jaw tightened. "She's not listed anywhere. It's like she vanished." Kendra felt a chill run through her. Angela had been their strongest link to the truth, the one person who could prove everything. And now she was gone. "She didn't just disappear," Kendra said sharply. "Someone moved her. They're covering their tracks." Eric glanced around nervously, lowering his voice. "We need to be careful, Kendra. If they're going this far, they're watching us too." Kendra clenched her fists, frustration boiling inside her. "We can't let them get away with this, Eric. Angela could be in danger." "I know," Eric said, "but we need to think this through. If we push too hard without proof, they'll bury us before we even get close." Kendra nodded reluctantly. "Then we find Angela, and we find that proof." They spent the rest of the morning searching for clues, checking transfer records, questioning nurses who had worked the night shift, and scanning every recovery ward in the hospital. But Angela was nowhere to be found. It was as though she had been erased from Briar Ridge altogether. By lunchtime, Kendra sat slumped in a corner of the cafeteria, her mind racing. Eric had gone to check the system again, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Around her, the hospital buzzed with its usual rhythm doctors in white coats, patients waiting for appointments, families whispering anxiously over meals. To everyone else, it was just another day. But to Kendra, it felt like the world was closing in. "Dr. Lewis?" The voice startled her. She looked up to see a young nurse standing beside her table. The woman's expression was nervous, her eyes darting around the room as if making sure no one else was listening. "Can I talk to you for a second?" the nurse whispered. Kendra straightened. Hope flickering in her chest. "Of course. What's your name?" "Maria," the nurse replied quietly. She gestured toward the far end of the cafeteria, where a small alcove offered a little privacy. Kendra followed her, her heart pounding. Once they were alone, Maria spoke quickly, her voice low. "I heard you were looking for Angela Cross." "Yes," Kendra said, trying to keep her voice calm. "Do you know where she is?" Maria hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before nodding. "I saw 2 men take her out of her room last night. They weren't wearing scrubs, just suits and security badges. They said she was being transferred to another facility, but—" "But what?" Kendra pressed. "But they looked wrong," Maria said. "I don't know how to explain it. I've worked here for years, and I've never seen them before, and there's no record of the transfer. I checked this morning." Kendra's heart sank. "Did you hear where they were taking her?" "No," Maria said apologetically. "I wish I knew more. I thought you should know. Be careful, Dr. Lewis." Kendra felt a swell of gratitude. "Thank you, Maria. You don't know how much this helps." Maria nodded quickly, then turned and disappeared back into the crowd, leaving Kendra alone. That afternoon, Kendra and Eric sat together in the records office, piecing together what little they had. The news about Angela's disappearance weighed heavily on them both. "They're hiding her," Eric said, his voice tight, "and they're making it harder for us to find her. If we don't get to Angela soon, we'll lose her forever." "We won't lose her," Kendra replied firmly, though her own doubts gnawed at her. "We'll find her, Eric. We have to." Eric rubbed a hand over his face. "What's our next move?" Kendra thought for a moment, her mind racing. "We find someone else who can talk. Maria's proof that there are people here who know what's going on. Someone will crack." "And if they don't?" Eric asked softly. Kendra met his gaze, her eyes steely. "Then we'll expose them ourselves, every single one of them." Eric nodded, though his expression remained grim. "We're running out of time, Kendra. If they're willing to make people disappear, they won't stop there." Kendra glanced out the small window, the gray clouds thickening over the city skyline. The stakes were higher now than ever before. Angela was missing, patients were in danger, and the people responsible were closing in on her. But Kendra refused to back down. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to think of her mother, her soft voice, her unwavering belief in doing the right thing. Courage is doing what's right, even when you're afraid. Kendra took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. "We're going to end this," she said quietly. Eric nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's hope we can—" The sun had barely begun to rise, its faint orange glow slicing through the heavy clouds, when Kendra found herself staring out the window of the records office. Her reflection stared back at her dark circles under her eyes, her usually polished hair in a loose, unkempt bun. The weight of Angela's disappearance pressed against her like a physical force, but there was no time to stop, no time to grieve the growing losses. Eric sat slumped in the chair across the room, his laptop open, fingers tapping rhythmically against the keyboard. The steady hum of the computer filled the silence between them. "Anything yet?" Kendra asked softly, breaking the quiet. Eric shook his head without looking up. "I've been through every transfer log from last night. Nothing. No paperwork. No signatures. Angela's just gone. Whoever took her knew how to cover their tracks." Kendra leaned her forehead against the cool glass, closing her eyes for a brief moment. "We're missing something. Someone knows where she is." Eric sighed, his tone filled with frustration. "And the clock is ticking, Kendra. If they've moved her, they've either scared her into silence or—" He did not finish, but Kendra knew what he was thinking. The unspoken possibility made her chest tighten. Before she could reply, there was a sharp knock on the door. Kendra jumped slightly, her nerves raw, but Eric stood quickly and opened it a crack. Standing on the other side was Dr. Ellen Carter. "Dr. Lewis," Ellen said, her voice low and urgent as she slipped inside. her sharp eyes darting toward the hallway to ensure no one had seen her. She closed the door firmly behind her. "Dr. Carter," Kendra asked, startled. "What are you doing here?" Ellen looked at Eric briefly, then back at Kendra. "I need to speak to you. Alone." Eric glanced at Kendra for confirmation, and she gave him a small nod. "I'll wait outside," he muttered, grabbing his laptop and leaving the room. Ellen remained silent until Eric had disappeared down the hallway. She turned to Kendra, her usual calm veneer now fractured, revealing something raw underneath concern, and maybe even fear. "What's going on?" Kendra asked, her voice cautious. Ellen let out a long breath, as though the weight of what she was about to say had been crushing her for days. "You're right," she said finally. "About Angela Cross, about the altered records." Kendra froze, the words settling in her chest like a heavy stone. "You know?" Ellen nodded grimly, stepping closer. "I've known for a while that something wasn't right. I've seen irregularities numbers that didn't add up, treatments ordered under false pretenses. But She paused, her voice faltering. "I didn't know how deep it went, or how dangerous it had become." Kendra's heart pounded in her chest. "Why didn't you say anything?" Ellen's shoulders sagged. "Because I didn't have proof, and I didn't think anyone would believe me. Dr. Grant has the administration in his pocket. He's been untouchable for years." The name alone sent a jolt of anger through Kendra. "Dr. Grant is behind this?" "Yes," Ellen said softly. "And he's not alone. There are others, physicians, administrators, maybe even people outside the hospital. I've tried to stay quiet, but when Angela Cross disappeared last night—" "You know about Angela?" Kendra interrupted, stepping forward. Ellen nodded, her expression grim. "I overheard 2 of Dr. Grant's men talking about moving her. They said she was no longer a problem. I don't know where she is now, but I'm afraid for her." Kendra felt a surge of panic. "We have to find her, Dr. Carter. She's the key to everything." "I know," Ellen replied, her voice firm now. "That's why I'm here. You're the only person who's been brave enough to try to stop this. I want to help you, Kendra. I'll get you what you need: names, files, records, whatever it takes to expose them." Kendra blinked, taken aback. For so long, she had felt utterly alone in this fight. Now, here was Ellen. Someone on the inside, someone with access offering to stand beside her. "Why now?" Kendra asked quietly. Ellen's gaze softened. "Because I can't keep looking the other way. I became a doctor to help people, not to watch them suffer while others profit. If I don't act now, I'll never forgive myself." Kendra felt a lump rise in her throat. For all the fear and pressure she had been carrying, this was a moment of light, a glimmer of hope in a storm that had seemed endless. "Thank you," Kendra said sincerely. "I don't know what to say." "Don't thank me yet," Ellen replied, her tone serious. "We still have a lot of work to do. I'll start by pulling any financial records I can get my hands on. But we'll have to be careful. Dr. Grant will know someone is digging." Kendra nodded. "We'll be careful. But we can't stop now. Angela needs us, and so do the patients who came before her." Ellen gave her a tight smile, then glanced at the door. "I need to go before anyone sees me here. I'll be in touch soon." Kendra watched as Ellen slipped back out into the hallway, her white coat disappearing around the corner. For the first time in weeks, Kendra felt something other than fear. She felt determination and hope. When Eric returned, Kendra told him everything. He listened silently, his expression shifting from disbelief to relief as she recounted Ellen's offer to help. "I can't believe it," Eric said finally. "Ellen Carter, of all people. I never thought she'd take a stand." "Me neither," Kendra admitted. "But we need her. She can get us the records we need to prove this real evidence, not just suspicions." Eric nodded, his brow furrowed. "Okay, so, what now?" "Now we find Angela," Kendra replied firmly. "Ellen gave us confirmation that Dr. Grant moved her, but we don't know where. There has to be someone else in the hospital who saw something, another nurse, a janitor, someone who works the night shift. Eric rubbed his chin thoughtfully. I'll check with my contacts in security. Maybe someone noticed something weird on the cameras last night. Good idea, Kendra said, her mind already spinning with plans. And I'll go through Angela's file again, see if there's any clue we missed about where they might have taken her. Eric hesitated before speaking again, his voice soft. Kendra, you know they're going to push back harder, right? The closer we get, the more dangerous this is going to become. Kendra met his gaze, her expression resolute. I know, but we can't stop now. Eric managed a small smile. I guess I'm all in then. Kendra smiled back, grateful for him, grateful that, despite everything, she was not alone anymore. That night, as Kendra sat at her kitchen table with Angela's files spread out before her, she let herself feel something she had not allowed in weeks. Hope. Ellen's involvement changed everything. With her help, they could finally gather the evidence they needed to take this beyond Briar Ridge to the medical board, to the authorities. But as Kendra traced Angela's name on the file, a pang of guilt pierced her. Angela was out there somewhere, scared, vulnerable, and possibly hurt. She had trusted Kendra, and now she was paying the price. I'll find you, Kendra thought, her jaw tightening. I won't let them silence you. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, and the city beyond her small apartment stretched into the darkness. For all the fear and uncertainty, one thing was clear now. The truth was within reach, and Kendra would not stop until she brought it into the light. The hospital corridors hummed with quiet energy the next morning, but Kendra felt as though she were moving through fog. After weeks of chasing shadows, the pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to come together. Ellen Carter's courage to step forward had ignited something within her, an urgency she could no longer ignore. But with that urgency came a heavier realization. They were running out of time. Angela was still missing, the trail growing colder by the hour. If Kendra could not find her or uncover solid proof soon, she knew the people behind this would bury the truth for good. When she arrived at Briar Ridge, Eric was already waiting for her in the unused records office. He sat hunched over his laptop, dark circles under his eyes, and a half-empty coffee cup beside him. Morning, Kendra said softly as she entered. Morning, Eric replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion. He gestured to the screen. You're not going to believe this. I found something. Kendra moved closer, her heart quickening. Eric turned the laptop toward her. The hospital security logs. I had a friend check the night Angela disappeared. 2 security guards, ones we've never seen before, signed into the system at 2:03 a.m. They logged out at 3:12. What were they doing? Kendra asked, leaning closer. That's the thing, Eric said, clicking through the records. There's no report from that night, no incidents logged. It's like they were ghosts, but my friend managed to pull up the raw security footage. Look at this. Eric opened a grainy video file showing the 3rd-floor recovery wing, Angela's floor. Kendra watched as 2 men in dark suits, faces obscured by caps, entered the frame. One of them pushed an empty wheelchair, while the other carried a black folder tucked under his arm. They moved silently and efficiently, pausing outside Angela's room. Eric paused the video. Watch this part. The men entered Angela's room. A minute later, they emerged. Angela in the wheelchair, her head slumped forward as though she were asleep or sedated. The 2 men wheeled her down the hall, disappearing out of view. Kendra stared at the screen, her blood running cold. They drugged her, she whispered. Eric nodded grimly. They took her somewhere, Kendra, and they didn't leave through the front entrance. There's a service exit on the east wing that bypasses the cameras. That's probably how they got her out. Kendra felt a mix of anger and helplessness rise in her chest. We need to show this to Ellen. She can help us escalate it. Get the authorities involved. Eric hesitated. I agree. But there's more. My contact found something else, a financial account linked to Dr. Grant. It's offshore, And the deposits match the insurance payouts from the altered cases. He's funneling the money, Kendra. This could tie him directly to the fraud. Kendra sat down heavily in the chair, her mind spinning. We've got him. Between this and the footage, we have enough to expose him. Ellen can help us get this in front of the right people. Eric looked at her carefully. Kendra, you realize what this means, right? If we go to Ellen, there's no turning back. They'll know we're coming for them. Kendra's jaw tightened. Let them know. I'm done hiding. Later that afternoon, Kendra and Eric met Ellen in her office, a quiet corner of the hospital where few people ventured without reason. The blinds were drawn, the door locked. Ellen sat behind her desk, reviewing the security footage on Eric's laptop, her face pale. This is worse than I thought, Ellen murmured, pausing the video. They didn't even try to cover their tracks completely. They're getting bolder. Kendra leaned forward. We also found a financial trail accounts tied directly to Dr. Grant. He's orchestrating this. Ellen nodded, her expression dark. That doesn't surprise me. Grant has been untouchable for years. He's built alliances with people in high places, people who will do anything to protect him. If we're going to take this public, we need to be careful. Kendra's fists clenched. We don't have time to be careful. Angela is out there somewhere, Ellen. We need to find her before it's too late. Ellen looked at Kendra, her eyes softening. I understand, but we have to be smart about this. If we go to the authorities without airtight proof, Grant will bury everything and us with it. I'll speak to my contacts at the state medical board. If we can bring this to them first, they can start an investigation without tipping off Grant and his people. Eric frowned. How long will that take? A few days, Ellen admitted. Maybe less if we push hard enough. Kendra's frustration bubbled over. Angela doesn't have a few days. They've already hurt her. What if they... She stopped, unable to finish the thought. Ellen stood and placed a hand gently on Kendra's shoulder. We'll find her, Kendra. I promise you. But we can't make mistakes now. If we do, Angela won't be the only one they silence. Kendra looked down, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Ellen was right, even if it felt like the clock was ticking faster with every second. What can we do in the meantime? Eric asked. Ellen straightened. Keep digging. We need as much evidence as we can get. I'll start the process with the medical board, and you two focus on finding Angela. Kendra nodded, her resolve hardening again. We'll find her. That evening, Kendra sat in Eric's car parked a block away from Briar Ridge. The hospital loomed in the distance, its windows glowing faintly against the darkening sky. They had spent hours combing through files, patient logs, and the security records again. But Angela's trail remained frustratingly cold. Eric drummed his fingers against the steering wheel. We're missing something. These people don't make mistakes, Kendra. They planned this too well. Kendra stared out the windshield, her eyes scanning the shadowy streets. Maybe someone who works the night shift saw something. Janitors, transport staff people, who don't usually get noticed. Eric raised an eyebrow. You want to question the overnight staff? You realize how suspicious that'll look, right? Kendra turned to him, her gaze steady. We don't have a choice. Someone saw something. We just need to find them. Eric sighed, shaking his head, but a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. You really don't give up, do you? Not when it matters, Kendra replied softly. They sat in silence for a moment before Eric's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. It's from my contact in security. He says someone's flagged the footage we pulled. They know someone's been digging. Kendra felt a chill crawl down her spine. What does that mean? Eric's expression darkened. It means we're out of time. If they find out we have that video, they'll come after us next. Kendra's pulse quickened, but she steadied herself. Then we get ahead of them. We take what we have and go to the medical board. Tonight. Eric hesitated, but when he saw the determination in her eyes, he nodded. Okay, let's finish this. As they drove through the quiet streets toward Ellen's house, where they planned to regroup and hand over the evidence, Kendra felt a strange calm settle over her. The truth was close now, so close she could almost touch it. But as they turned onto a narrow road leading to Ellen's neighborhood, Kendra noticed a dark SUV in the rearview mirror. It was following them, its headlights cutting through the shadows. "Eric," Kendra said quietly, her voice tight, "do you see that car?" Eric glanced in the mirror, his expression hardening. "Yeah, I see it." The SUV picked up speed, closing the distance between them. "They're following us," Eric muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. Kendra's heart pounded in her chest. "What do we do?" Eric's jaw tightened. "Hold on." He hit the gas, the car surging forward as the SUV sped up behind them, its headlights blinding in the mirror. Kendra braced herself against the seat, fear knotting in her stomach. "We're not losing them," Eric said through gritted teeth. The SUV moved closer, its grille nearly touching their bumper. Kendra's breath caught as Eric swerved onto a side street, tires screeching against the pavement. "Eric!" "I've got this," Eric said sharply, his knuckles white on the wheel. But the SUV followed, relentless. Kendra clutched the seat, her mind racing. She thought of Angela, of the patients whose lives had been shattered, of the truth that was just within reach. "We can't let them stop us," she whispered, her voice shaking. Eric's eyes narrowed, his focus locked on the road. "They won't." Eric swerved onto another side street, tires screeching as they rounded the corner. The SUV stayed close behind, its headlights glaring like twin suns through the darkness. Kendra's pulse raced as she gripped the edge of her seat. The world outside the car was a blur of concrete and shadows, but inside, every moment felt painfully sharp and real. "They're not backing off," Eric muttered, his voice strained. Kendra looked over her shoulder at the pursuing vehicle. The SUV was relentless, its intentions clear. This wasn't a warning, it was an escalation. "We can't just keep running, Eric," she said, her voice tight with panic. "They'll run us off the road." Eric glanced at her briefly before nodding, his mind working quickly. "You're right. We need to lose them now." He swerved onto a narrow alleyway between two old industrial buildings. The car jolted violently as it hit a pothole, but Eric kept his foot on the gas. The alley was barely wide enough for their car, the brick walls closing in on either side. Kendra held her breath as the SUV screeched to a stop at the mouth of the alley. Its headlights flooded the narrow space, illuminating their car like a spotlight. "They're stopping," Kendra breathed, her voice trembling. Eric exhaled sharply, his hand still gripping the wheel. "They won't follow us through here." "It's too tight." Kendra's eyes remained on the rearview mirror, watching as the SUV idled ominously at the alley entrance. For several tense seconds, it didn't move. Then, slowly, the headlights dimmed, and the vehicle backed away, disappearing into the shadows. "They're gone," Eric said, but his voice carried no relief. "For now." Kendra let out a shaky breath, her heart still hammering in her chest. "What was that, Eric?" "Who were they?" Eric shook his head, his face pale. "It's Grant's people." "It has to be. They know we have something on them, and they're trying to shut us down before we go public." Kendra stared ahead, her hands trembling. The gravity of the situation sank deeper into her bones. This wasn't just about exposing fraud anymore. This was about survival. "They're desperate," she whispered. "They wouldn't do this unless they knew we were close to the truth." Eric glanced at her, his eyes serious. "Which means we don't have time to waste. We have to get this evidence to Ellen tonight." Kendra nodded, determination settling like a stone in her chest. "Let's go." When they arrived at Ellen's house, the quiet suburban street was dark and still. Eric pulled up to the curb, shutting off the headlights as they both scanned the area cautiously. Kendra's heart still raced from the chase, but she forced herself to focus. "Let's get inside," Eric said, his voice low. Ellen's house was a modest two-story home with a narrow walkway lined with overgrown hedges. The front porch light was off, but a faint glow shone from one of the windows. Kendra clutched her bag tightly, the weight of the evidence inside feeling heavier than ever. Eric knocked softly on the door. A moment later, Ellen opened it, her expression anxious. She gestured for them to come in quickly, locking the door behind them. "You made it," Ellen said, her voice strained. "I was starting to worry." Kendra met her eyes. "They came after us. A black SUV grants people. They tried to run us off the road." Ellen's face paled. "Are you both okay?" "We're fine," Eric said. "But we don't have time to lose. They're onto us, Ellen. If we don't move fast, they'll bury this." Ellen nodded, motioning for them to follow her into the small living room. "I've contacted a friend on the state medical board. He's willing to meet with us tomorrow morning. I trust him. He's been fighting corruption like this for years." Kendra sat down, pulling the files and Eric's laptop from her bag. "This is everything we have so far: altered patient records, financial transfers, and security footage of Angela's disappearance." Ellen sat beside them, her sharp eyes scanning the documents. "This is good, Kendra. It's enough to start an official investigation." Eric nodded, though his expression remained tense. "If we can make it to the medical board tomorrow, Grant's people won't be able to stop it, but they know we're coming. We need to be careful." Kendra's voice was steady, but her mind still raced. "What about Angela? We can't leave her out there, Ellen. She trusted me." Ellen placed a hand on Kendra's arm. "We'll find her. Once the board starts their investigation, we'll have the resources to track her down. You've done more than anyone else could have, Kendra." The words were meant to reassure her, but Kendra couldn't shake the image of Angela's pale face as the men wheeled her away. "We can't let them win," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. Ellen looked between Kendra and Eric, her face resolute. "We won't. You two have already done more than anyone else here dared to. But this ends tomorrow, one way or another." Kendra nodded, feeling the weight of Ellen's words settle into her chest. Tomorrow would be the turning point, the moment they would either expose the truth or lose everything. Eric stood, stretching his stiff shoulders. "We should get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Ellen agreed, leading them to the door. As Kendra stepped outside, the cool night air felt sharp against her skin. The street was still empty, the silence unnerving. "Be careful tonight," Ellen said softly, watching them. "We're close, but that makes them more dangerous." "We will," Eric replied, his voice low. Kendra turned back to Ellen, holding her gaze. "Thank you for everything. We couldn't have done this without you." Ellen smiled faintly. "Just make sure this counts, Kendra." As they walked back to Eric's car, Kendra felt the familiar weight of fear pressing down on her. But beneath it was something stronger, a spark of determination she refused to let go. Eric unlocked the car and paused before getting in, glancing around the quiet street. "Something feels off," he muttered. Kendra tensed, following his gaze. "What do you mean?" Eric shook his head, sliding into the driver's seat. "Maybe it's just me. Let's get out of here." As they drove away, Kendra stared out the window, her mind racing with everything that lay ahead. Tomorrow would be the day they brought everything into the light. But as the dark streets blurred past, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. The night air was crisp and heavy as Eric drove cautiously through the silent streets. The headlights cut a narrow path through the darkness, but it did little to ease Kendra's growing unease. She sat rigid in the passenger seat, her gaze shifting nervously between the road ahead and the empty rearview mirror. "Are you sure we weren't followed?" she asked softly. Eric tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his face a mask of focus. "I'm sure. I've been watching since we left Ellen's place. Nothing's behind us." Kendra nodded, though the tension in her chest refused to loosen. The black SUV's pursuit earlier still haunted her, the way it had tailed them with calculated precision, almost forcing them off the road. Grant's people weren't playing games anymore. They were sending a message. "We're too close," she murmured, half to herself. "They know it, Eric. That's why they're doing this." Eric glanced at her briefly. "I know. That's why we've got to keep moving. No more second-guessing. No more hesitation. We hand over the evidence to the medical board tomorrow, and this thing is done." Kendra wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that all the late nights, the fear, and the mounting danger would finally pay off, that exposing the truth would bring justice to Angela and all the other patients who had suffered. But deep down, a voice whispered, "What if it's not enough?" Eric's phone buzzed suddenly, breaking the silence. He fumbled to pick it up, holding it to his ear as he continued driving. "Yeah? Who is this?" Kendra watched his expression shift from confusion to alarm. "Slow down," Eric said sharply, his voice rising. "What do you mean? What happened?" He listened for a few seconds more, then cursed under his breath before ending the call. "What is it?" Kendra asked, her heart pounding. Eric shook his head, his jaw tight. "That was my contact in security. Someone wiped the footage." Kendra froze. "What?" "The video we pulled of Angela being taken from her room. It's gone, completely erased from the hospital servers." Kendra's pulse quickened. "But you made a copy, right?" "Yeah, on my laptop," Eric replied. "But this means they know exactly what we have. They're covering their tracks faster than we can keep up." A chill ran down Kendra's spine. "How did they find out? Does your contact know?" "No," Eric muttered, shaking his head. "He said there was a breach in the security system. Whoever did it know what they were looking for." Kendra slumped back against her seat, the weight of it all pressing down on her. "They're closing in, Eric. They're not going to let us take this to the medical board." Eric's face was grim as he turned onto a quieter road that led back toward Kendra's apartment. "They can try, but we're not backing down now." When they reached Kendra's building, Eric pulled the car to a stop, but kept the engine running. The lot was dark, the streetlights flickering faintly. Kendra scanned the area, her instincts prickling. "Something's wrong," she whispered. Eric frowned. "What do you mean?" "Stay here," Kendra said, grabbing her bag. "Let me check it out." "No way," Eric replied firmly, shutting off the car. "If something's wrong, we're not splitting up." They stepped out of the car together, the cool night air biting at their skin. The building was silent, too silent. Kendra's breath caught as she noticed the faint glint of glass near her parking spot. Her car, still where it had been left the night before, looked worse than before. The windows had been smashed again, but this time, something was different. "Eric, look," she whispered, pointing. A small folded piece of paper had been wedged under the windshield wiper, fluttering faintly in the breeze. Eric moved cautiously ahead, pulling it free. His face hardened as he opened it and held it up for Kendra to see. The note was short, written in harsh black ink. "You were warned. Stop now, or there will be no next time." Kendra's stomach twisted. She backed away, her mind racing. "They were here, Eric. They're watching me." Eric crumpled the note in his fist, his voice low and controlled. "You're staying at my place tonight. You're not safe here." Kendra nodded numbly, letting Eric lead her back to the car. The thought of returning to her apartment where someone could be lurking, waiting, sent a chill through her. Eric's apartment was a small, unassuming space on the third floor of an older building. It was cluttered with books, papers, and medical journals, evidence of the long hours Eric spent working. He had clearly not expected company, but Kendra was too drained to care. "Make yourself comfortable," Eric said, tossing his keys onto the kitchen counter. "I'll grab some blankets for the couch." Kendra sank onto the worn sofa, clutching her bag against her chest. She felt raw, stripped down to her most vulnerable state. The exhaustion was bone deep, but sleep felt impossible. "Here," Eric said, handing her a blanket. "You can try to get some rest." "Thanks," Kendra murmured, unfolding it over her lap. Eric sat down in the armchair across from her, running a hand through his hair. We're close, Kendra. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but we are. Kendra nodded, though her voice shook. But at what cost? Angela's missing. My career is hanging by a thread. And now they're threatening me outright. Eric leaned forward, his gaze steady. You're still here, Kendra. That's what matters. You didn't give up. And because of you, we have a chance to stop this. Kendra met his eyes, the quiet conviction in his voice cutting through the chaos swirling in her mind. What if we fail, Eric? We won't, he said simply. Because you won't let us. For the first time in days, Kendra allowed herself a faint smile. Despite everything, Eric was still here. Ellen was still helping. And as fragile as their position was, she had allies she could count on. The quiet between them stretched, but it felt less suffocating now, more like a brief reprieve. Kendra finally leaned back against the cushions, the blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. We need to get to the medical board first thing in the morning, Eric said softly. They'll try to stop us, but if we're smart, we can get ahead of them. Kendra nodded, exhaustion finally beginning to pull at her. Tomorrow, she whispered. We'll end this tomorrow. Eric watched her for a moment longer before standing and retreating to the small kitchen. Kendra listened to the faint sounds of him moving around running water, opening cabinets. Slowly, her breathing evened, the weight of the day finally starting to give way to sleep. But just as she began to drift off, the quiet was shattered by the shrill ring of Eric's phone. Kendra bolted upright, her heart racing. Eric snatched the phone off the counter, his expression darkening as he glanced at the screen. It's Ellen, he said, answering quickly. Ellen, what's wrong? Kendra watched as Eric's face drained of color. What? He said hoarsely. When? The silence that followed felt like a lifetime. Finally, Eric lowered the phone, his hands shaking. What happened? Kendra asked, her voice barely a whisper. Eric swallowed hard, looking up at her with a grim expression. Ellen's house. There was a fire. Kendra's blood ran cold. What? They think it was intentional, Eric said softly. She didn't make it, Kendra. The room spun around her, the walls seeming to close in. No, Kendra whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. No, that's not possible. Eric sat down heavily, his hands burying his face. They're silencing anyone who gets in their way. First Angela, now Ellen. Kendra's chest tightened, grief and anger clawing their way up to the surface. Ellen had risked everything to help them, and now she was gone. But through the grief, one thought burned like fire. They think this will stop me, but they're wrong. Kendra stood slowly, her hands clenched into fists. We take this public, Eric. Tomorrow morning, no matter what happens, we end this. Eric looked up at her, his expression hardening. Agreed. As the night stretched on, Kendra knew one thing for certain. They had nothing left to lose. Kendra sat in Eric's car, staring blankly through the windshield as dawn broke over the city skyline. The pale light spilled across empty streets, painting them in cold shades of blue and gray. The night before felt like a blur, a storm of grief, anger, and fear that left her hollow. Ellen is gone. The thought rang through her mind over and over, like a bell she could not silence. Ellen had been their ally, their hope. Now she was another casualty of the truth, a truth too dangerous for the people behind it to let surface. Beside her, Eric sat with his head against the steering wheel. Neither of them had slept. He had barely spoken since the news came. They both knew what had to be done next, but the weight of it sat between them like a ghost. Kendra's phone buzzed suddenly, jolting her out of her thoughts. She grabbed it quickly, her hands trembling. It was a text unknown number, but this time the words chilled her to the bone. This is your last warning. Turn back, or you'll end up like her. Kendra's breath caught. Her hands shook as she lowered the phone to her lap. They're still watching us, she whispered. Eric lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot but sharp. Let them watch. They're scared. Kendra looked at him, surprised by the resolve in his voice. Eric. No, he said firmly, sitting up. They've taken too much. Ellen, Angela, whoever else they've hurt this end today. We're taking everything we have to the medical board. I don't care what they do to stop us. Kendra swallowed hard, his words echoing the fire that had begun to burn deep in her own chest. She thought of Angela's face, pale and frightened, Ellen's soft, steady voice, the patients who trusted their doctors and were betrayed. They've tried to silence us, Kendra said softly, more to herself than to Eric. But they can't stop the truth. Not this time. Eric nodded, starting the engine. Let's finish this. The drive to the state medical board's headquarters felt like hours, though it was barely 30 minutes. The streets buzzed with early morning commuters, the normalcy of it all a jarring contrast to the storm raging inside Kendra's mind. They parked a block away from the office building, an unassuming structure with glass doors and a polished facade. As they stepped out of the car, Eric pulled a black messenger bag from the back seat, the laptop and files containing their evidence safely inside. You ready? He asked, looking at Kendra. She nodded, though her heart pounded in her chest. As ready as I'll ever be. They approached the entrance, their footsteps echoing against the concrete. Kendra scanned the area instinctively, looking for anyone out of place. A dark sedan sat idling across the street, but there were no black SUVs, no men in suits lurking in the shadows. Still, the feeling of being watched never left her. Eric pushed open the glass door, and they stepped inside the quiet lobby. A woman sat at the reception desk, her glasses perched low on her nose as she typed on a keyboard. Can I help you? She asked without looking up. Yes, Eric said. We're here to see Mr. Peter Callahan. He's expecting us. The woman paused and glanced up, eyeing them curiously. And your names? Dr. Kendra Lewis and Dr. Eric Reynolds, Kendra replied. The receptionist hesitated, then nodded. One moment. She picked up the phone and murmured something Kendra could not hear. Finally, she hung up and offered a faint smile. You can go up. 3rd floor, room 312. Thank you, Kendra said, though her voice sounded distant even to herself. Peter Callahan was a tall, wiry man in his 60s, with sharp features and a quiet intensity that made him seem perpetually alert. His office was clean and sparsely decorated, its large windows overlooking the city below. When Kendra and Eric entered, he stood and extended his hand. Dr. Lewis, Dr. Reynolds, I appreciate you coming in so early, he said, his voice calm and professional. Please, sit down. Thank you for meeting with us, Kendra said, shaking his hand before lowering herself into the chair across from his desk. Eric placed the messenger bag on the table, unzipping it carefully. We have something you need to see, Mr. Callahan. Evidence of insurance fraud, falsified medical records, and the endangerment of patients at Briar Ridge Medical Center. Callahan's sharp gaze flicked to Eric. Those are serious allegations, Dr. Reynolds. Eric nodded. We wouldn't be here if we weren't sure. He opened the laptop, pulling up the files. Kendra watched as Callahan leaned closer, his expression hardening as he scanned through the documents, the financial records, the altered test results, the falsified chemo protocols. When Eric played the grainy footage of Angela being taken from her hospital room, Callahan sat back in his chair, his face pale. This is... Callahan trailed off, choosing his words carefully. This is deeply troubling. Dr. Grant is behind it, Kendra said, her voice steady despite the anger burning inside her. He's been orchestrating this for years, profiting off unnecessary treatments and putting patients at risk. And he's not alone. There are others involved, administrators, possibly even security staff. Callahan nodded, his expression unreadable. And you're certain of all this? We are, Eric replied. Angela Cross is missing because of this. Ellen Carter, One of our colleagues who tried to help us was killed last night. These people will stop at nothing to silence anyone who stands in their way. Kendra watched as Callahan folded his hands on the desk, his eyes fixed on the screen. For a long moment, he said nothing. Finally, he looked up at them. "I'll take this to the board immediately," he said. "An investigation will begin today. If what you're saying is true, Briar Ridge won't be able to cover this up for long." Relief flooded Kendra's chest, so sharp it nearly took her breath away. "Thank you," she said softly. Callahan's gaze lingered on her. "Dr. Lewis, what you've done here, what both of you have done, it took courage. Not many people would have risked this much to expose the truth." Kendra nodded, her throat tight. Patients deserve better. Someone had to stand up for them. Callahan stood, extending his hand again. "I'll be in touch soon. Stay careful in the meantime." As Kendra and Eric stepped back into the cool morning air, the weight on Kendra's chest finally began to lift. The truth was no longer buried. It was out there now, unstoppable. "They can't hide it anymore," Eric said, his voice laced with relief. Kendra nodded, the first genuine smile in days tugging at her lips. "No, they can't." For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to hope. Angela would be found. Grant and his allies would face justice, and the patients, the ones whose voices had been stolen, would finally be heard. Eric nudged her gently as they walked back to the car. "You did it, Kendra." Kendra looked at him, her smile growing. "We did it." As they drove away, the city waking up around them, Kendra turned her face toward the rising sun. The shadows were retreating now, pushed back by the light. There was still grief. Ellen's loss would weigh on her forever. Angela's fate was still uncertain. But in this moment, Kendra knew she had done what was right. Her mother's voice echoed softly in her mind. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Kendra. It's acting in spite of it." Kendra sat a little taller in her seat, the fire inside her burning brighter than ever. Whatever came next, she was ready. 2 months later, the halls of Briar Ridge Medical Center felt very different. The whispers had stopped, replaced by open conversations. The old fear that had once lingered like a shadow was gone. Dr. Michael Grant and several other administrators had been arrested. Their crimes, insurance fraud, falsifying records, and patient endangerment had made headlines nationwide. Angela Cross had been found at a private rehabilitation clinic just days after the investigation began. She was recovering slowly, but when Kendra visited her, Angela had smiled weakly and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." Now, as Kendra stood outside her newly opened clinic, the Lewis Dermatology and Care Center, she looked at the shining sign with pride. Her small practice was modest, nestled in a neighborhood that needed it most, but it was hers. It was built on integrity, honesty, and a promise to her patients that they would always come first. Eric leaned against the doorway, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Not bad, Dr. Lewis," he said with a grin, handing her one. "From chaos to this in just 2 months. You really don't know how to quit, do you?" Kendra smiled as she sipped the coffee, the morning sun warm on her face. "I had good help," Eric smirked. "Don't get sentimental on me." She looked out at the quiet street, feeling a calm she had not felt in months. The fight had been long, and it had cost her dearly, but the truth had won. That mattered. Turning to face the camera Eric had set up earlier, something about showing the world what you've built. Kendra straightened and smiled warmly. "To everyone watching this, I hope my story reminds you to fight for what's right, even when it's hard. Never let fear silence you, because the truth always matters." If you enjoyed this journey, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can keep telling stories of courage, hope, and perseverance. Thank you for being here. And as always, take care of each other. Eric gave her a thumbs up from behind the camera, grinning. "Not bad, Dr. Lewis. Not bad at all." As Kendra stepped back into her clinic, ready to see her first patient of the day, she glanced up at the sunlit sign one more time. It was a new beginning, and she knew no matter how difficult the road ahead, she would keep walking it. For the truth, for her patience, and for hope. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more stories like this. Together we can inspire and stand up for what matters. See you next time.